Let's walk through the adrenal glands. These are also part of the endocrine system, so these are glands involved in releasing hormones. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys, and they have an outer portion that's called the cortex and an inner portion called the medulla. I always remember middle medulla. The cortex, the adrenal cortex, releases the three hormones listed here: mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadoccorticoids. Now, every single one of these ends with corticoid, which means cortex. So these are the hormones coming from the adrenal cortex. The prefix that you see is kind of telling you what that hormone is involved in. So mineralocorticoids are important in mineral balance or electrolyte balance. Glucocorticoids are important in glucose or metabolism. And gonadoccorticoids are actually weak sex hormones. So think of your gonads, the testes and the ovaries. So those are the three hormones that come from the adrenal cortex that we're going to walk through. The adrenal medulla, the middle part of the adrenal gland, releases some hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine. And we have talked about those before, particularly when we talked about the nervous system. These hormones are involved in that fight or flight response. So let's start with those. Again, the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine are released in the adrenal medulla, and these are considered stress hormones because they are so instrumental in that fight or flight response. So what do they do? Think about what happens, everything happening internally when you are scared. Your breathing rate goes up, your heart rate goes up, your blood sugar levels will actually start to rise. And this physiologically should make sense. If you have more sugar, more glucose available in your blood, that means you have more capability to go through cell respiration and make energy, to make ATP. And you need ATP for your muscles to contract. So if you've got to run, you want to have enough sugar in your blood that you can continue producing ATP and getting out of there, get those muscles working. You're also going to be dilating your blood vessels going into the muscles. So you're going to be pumping as much blood as you can into your muscles, and all the vessels that are going into your intestines are going to constrict and get real small because you are not worried about digesting food when you are in that fight or flight response. When you have released epinephrine or norepinephrine, you are worrying about fleeing. So those are the hormones that are coming from the adrenal medulla, those fight or flight hormones. Now, the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex, we have three different ones. Remember, they all end in corticoid, so cortex. That should be an easy way to remember. And so let's go through each one of these. We're going to start with the mineralocorticoids. So I told you that it ends with corticoid, so you know that it comes from the cortex. And it starts with mineral. So you know that this one is involved in mineral salt balance or electrolyte balance. So mineralocorticoids actually will increase the amount of sodium in the blood. They act on the kidneys to increase tubular reabsorption of sodium. So instead of urinating out the sodium, you reabsorb it, you put it right back in your bloodstream so it stays in the bloodstream. Now, one thing that is important to remember, and I know we haven't talked about the urinary system yet, but in our body, water will always follow solute. And in this case, we can think water always follows salt. Right? So if we put salt or sodium and save it and put it back in our bloodstream, that also means we're adding water back to our bloodstream. So we're going to increase that blood volume. So this can play a role on increasing your blood pressure. The chief mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. So you may have heard of that one before, aldosterone. So again, remember, water will always follow solute, or we can also say water follows salt. So if you save sodium, you're also going to be saving and retaining water. Another one of the hormones coming from the adrenal cortex are glucocorticoids. So again, it's ending with glucocorticoid, so you know it's the cortex, and this time the prefix is gluco or glucose. So this one really affects carbohydrate metabolism. Glucocorticoids tend to raise your blood sugar levels. They do this by breaking down proteins and helping to create sugar. So that's a process called gluconeogenesis. Now, normally with glucocorticoids, we have a daily rhythm of glucocorticoids. Typically, they will peak right before we wake up in the morning. That should make sense. We haven't eaten for 8 hours. You know, if we go to bed and we sleep for 8 hours, when we wake up, we haven't eaten for a very long period of time. So what glucocorticoids are doing is they're actually helping to bring your blood sugar up so that you have a little sugar available to create some energy before you can eat breakfast. Now, as you go to sleep, those glucocorticoids are going to start to drop off. And that's just because you don't need the sugar while you're sleeping. Everything slows down, your metabolism slows down. Now, stress can definitely disrupt this rhythm. And so this is one of the reasons why when you're really stressed, it can make it really hard to sleep as well, because your sugar levels are not waning as you go to bed like they should. Now, the principal glucocorticoid is one called cortisol. You may have heard of that one before. Remember, glucocorticoids are secreted in response to that hormone that's coming from the pituitary gland called adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then our last hormone coming from the adrenal cortex are gonadocorticoids. Remember, this prefix here starts with gonado. So our gonads are the ovaries and the testes. So these are basically weak androgens. Androgens are male sex hormones. These can get converted to testosterone or estrogen. And gonadocorticoids can actually contribute to the onset of puberty. They can contribute to the onset of secondary sex characteristics, so the development of breasts, the enlargement of the genitalia. Also, these can contribute to sex drive in women especially. And when a woman has gone through menopause and her ovaries stop producing estrogen, her gonadocorticoids are still functioning, they're still being released, and so coming from that adrenal cortex, there are still some estrogens, weak estrogens coming from the cortex. Now, there are some diseases that are associated with the adrenal cortex. One of them that I want to mention is called Cushing's disease. This is characterized by excess levels of cortisol, so a lot of cortisol. This might be caused, remember cortisol, let's go back here. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, so remember it has glucose in the name, so it helps to raise our blood sugar levels. Remember, it's secreted in response to that hormone coming from the pituitary gland. This one does sort of cycle throughout the day, so it does help with being awake and being asleep. So now that we've kind of reviewed that, let's look at this disease. This can be caused by a pituitary tumor because remember, those glucocorticoids are being released in response to some hormones coming from the pituitary gland. It can be caused by an adrenal cortex tumor because this is where the hormones are being released, or it can be caused by excess steroid consumption. And so the symptoms, if you have excess glucocorticoids like cortisol, hyperglycemia, basically that just means you have high blood sugar levels. Also, remember, one of the reasons why you have high sugar levels when you have glucocorticoids present is because they are helping to break down protein and create that sugar. So sometimes what we'll see is a decline in bone and muscle protein. This is going to lead to weakness in the muscles. It can lead also to weak bones and bone fractures. So these are some things that are really common with Cushing's disease. Also, there will be a lot of water and salt retention, and so this can lead to some swelling, particularly of the face. So the face will get this very round appearance. Another thing that's indicative of Cushing's disease is redistribution of fat. So a lot of times there'll be this large area of fat on the posterior neck. And the treatment is to remove the tumor. So if it's a pituitary or an adrenal cortex tumor, it's got to be removed. Or if it's caused by excess steroid consumption, the steroids that you're taking need to be decreased, or you need to stop taking those. So here's an image of a patient with Cushing's disease, and you can see on the left, this is before Cushing's disease, and on the right, you can see this large hump. This is a large area of fat that gets deposited in patients with Cushing's disease. Sometimes it's called a buffalo hump. Also, the face gets much more round with Cushing's disease, and that's due to that salt retention. Another disease I'll mention is Addison's disease. Addison's disease is when the body, it's basically the opposite of Cushing's. The body destroys the adrenal cortex cells. So what happens is you don't produce all of those corticoids. So you're not producing as much gonatocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, or glucocorticoids. So the symptoms of this typically are you're really tired because your sugar levels are low. You're very weak because you don't have the mineralocorticoids saving the sodium. You're also not saving water, so your blood pressure is really low. And then another really indicative sign of Addison's is this bronzing of the skin. So you'll see down here at the bottom, I have an image of JFK. JFK was always very tan or bronze, and so it is thought that he actually had Addison's disease. The treatment for Addison's, if you're not producing enough of those corticoids, then the treatment is corticosteroid replacement therapy. So we'll give you those in place of the ones you're not making. Another one of the diseases that will affect the adrenal cortex is something called adrenogenital syndrome. This is a hypersecretion, so an oversecretion of gonatocorticoids. And again, remember corticoids, we know it's coming from the cortex. Gonato, these are the ones that are like a weak androgen. Remember, androgens are male hormones, sex hormones like testosterone. So in this syndrome, if you're secreting too many gonatocorticoids, it will lead to masculinization a lot in the genitalia. Now, this is not going to be noticeable in an adult male because an adult male is already releasing testosterone. The genitalia has already developed fully, so usually not something we would notice. But we do notice it in young males, prepubescent males, so if they haven't gone through puberty yet. What we'll see is that their reproductive organs look mature. They have a lot of secondary sex characteristics, so things like pubic hair at a young age. In females, it's also incredibly noticeable because they'll start to have patterns of hair the way a man would. So they might have a beard, so facial hair. They may have chest hair as well. And then I know we have not talked about the reproductive organs, but the clitoris and the penis are actually composed of the same embryonic tissue. It's erectile tissue. And so through the release of all of these male sex hormones, these gonatocorticoids, the clitoris will enlarge and almost look like a small penis. So here are some images of that. So you can see over here this image on the left. This is a baby, a little baby girl, and you can see that the labia almost resemble testicles, and you can see the clitoris resembles almost a small penis. You can see here this is a young girl, and you can see the pubic hair there. And then here you can see a young boy. Again, all of those secondary sex characteristics are present. The image here, this is a girl, and you can tell that clitoris resembles a penis here. So that is, these are some examples of adrenogenital syndrome. So we've walked through the adrenal gland and the hormones that come from the cortex and from the medulla. So the very last thing in this video that I want to talk about is the pineal gland. The pineal gland, if you remember, is that little gland that we find in the brain. It sits behind the epithalamus, behind the thalamus. And the pineal gland, the cells within that gland secrete melatonin. Melatonin is something that definitely affects your day-night cycles. I'm sure you've heard of melatonin before. Some people will take melatonin to help them go to bed at night. Melatonin also is involved in timing the sexual maturation and puberty of individuals. And it's heavily involved, because it's involved in day-night cycles, it's heavily involved in our circadian rhythm. So basically, when it's time to wake up, what our body temperature is, what our appetite is at any given period of time. So here's an image, and this is just showing you the cyclical levels of melatonin in the bloodstream. So you can see that when you're awake, melatonin levels are relatively low when you're awake, and then at nighttime, melatonin levels will drastically increase and they help with sleep. And then as you get closer to waking up, those levels drop back down. During the day, they're very low. And again, as you go to sleep at night, they rise. So this is again why people might take melatonin as a supplement to help them sleep at night.